Good evening, everyone. Let's start afresh. The newly sworn in President Joe Biden said, "We must end this uncivil war." Well, we have an hour of, I hope, organized listening, civilized disagreement, and discussion in a thinking that really is intended to ask whether that's possible, and if so, how, whether or not the divisions in America are so entrenched and meaningfully entrenched that it's going to be very difficult for that kind of unity that was at the heart of President Biden's inaugural address to become a reality. We're joined, and I'm extremely grateful, by all of you, people who I suppose want to do what we do in news meetings after inaugural addresses, chew over the bones of it and try and understand what the themes are and what the issues might be. But we're joined too by people who have lived and worked in, I suppose, the fundamental areas of America's public square. Dr. Emma Briant has researched and written about modern politics, the populist ends of it, the propaganda within it, and we're delighted that you join us from Northern Virginia. Emma, thank you. David Rhodes has washed up on the UK's shores. He's now in the business of setting up UK News, but joins us really to talk about American media. I got to know David when he was running CBS News and understands the networks, the cable news, he works in cable news as well, and the broader media environment. So David, thank you very much indeed for joining us too. And Bryan Lanza is here with us as well. I hope will help us understand the shape and state of the Republican Party now as it tries to conjure with a new president, the departure of Donald Trump, and what next in the midterms and looking towards 2024. If you've never been to a Thinking before, I should just say that it's intended really to be an open news meeting. It's where we do raise the thoughts that we've got. It's not intended to be just journalists speaking. We try and bring in people with different points of view so that we come away with a better informed opinion and understanding. So please do weigh in, tell us what you think, whether it's of the inaugural, whether you think it's of the presidency of Donald Trump, and what next for the Republican Party in American politics. I hope that in listening to all of those points of view, I'll come away, think things I haven't thought before, and get my own opinions and views challenged. I'm going to start, if I might, though, with David Rhodes. Partly, David, because I imagine that had this been a different time and we were not living in COVID, I would have said, let's go for a drink and let's really talk this one over. Because my central question really is whether or not you think the uncivil war ends, whether or not you think that Donald Trump is departing not just the White House, but the political scene, and if not, how he re-emerges.
Right. Well, look, he said he's coming back. So if you just take that at face value, those were his remarks today. But is he? I mean, first, there's been this discussion about a third party. And third parties in our country do not work. And I've actually told, not that we're intimates, but I have met with him. And I've told Donald Trump I worked for one, because the only presidential campaign that I ever worked on, which was before this media career, was the Perot campaign in 1992. And so I have firsthand experience of how doomed it is to try to do a third party. I also think, though, that some of the storytelling around Trump potentially starting a television network or buying one or doing streaming video or running again in 2024 are kind of overbought stories for different reasons. But I think that Trump leaves Washington today with a lot of financial problems in his core business and a lot of legal problems that are just the lingering effects of the past few years. And no one ever really knows what it's like to leave that job until they've actually done it. And there's always, at any given time, only a small handful of people who've had that experience. And they were all there today. So I think it's challenging and complicated and difficult and
And
probably
David,
flawed.
and David, why do you say that the TV network is unlikely?
Well, first of all, our medium has challenges of its own. Leave out Donald Trump's challenges, so we should just talk about those. The industry standard for monetization of news content in the United States is cable TV subscription fees, which are under severe threat and falling 10% year over year just on what we call cord cutting. At that rate, the incumbent cable sub-fee supported businesses won't have a business in 4 years. But established media companies are sort of well placed to figure out a technology transition to the next thing, which is digital streaming. And you've seen that happen in entertainment and increasingly in sport. So he'd be coming into that situation as an entrepreneur starting up. And there'd be plenty of resource available to him. But that is a challenging enough set of business circumstances for companies to navigate, like the Walt Disney Company or Netflix, the two which have been the most successful so far. You know, then if you come to it with all these other issues, it's even harder.
And David, I worry at moments like this that I have the intellectual rigor of a cushion. I sort of bent out of shape by the last person who sat on me. And the last person who sat on me was Joe Biden. And in that inaugural address, when it came to an end, I thought, well, that's it. For all the talk of Trump and Trumpism, it's over. His time as a political force, certainly an elected one, is most likely finished. Do you think that's a reasonable conclusion?
I don't, because in a way it's over. Like the Trump presidency is over. And of course, I just handicapped his chances of coming back in media and politics as being difficult. But where it's not over was that the speech, which was really well excerpted there in the opening, attempted to draw a line under it, but it only attempted. I mean, to talk about ending the Civil War, and of course, you know, we had the Civil War in the 1860s, and in a sense, it never ended. You know, I do think there's something wrong about the discussion of facts being manipulated. Like that is a very new phenomenon. Like that's never happened in politics before. No one's ever manipulated the facts, or you know, no one's ever lied. It's the first time anybody ever lied. Was the Trump administration? I mean, and that's not actually a political statement supporting or opposing Trump. It's just a lot of the difficulties that the United States has been through politically lately are not new and are not ended just by the fact of today's inauguration.
David, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, if I might, because as you may have seen, we put together some slides about this polling of American voters and also prospects for candidates. I'd like to come back to that in a bit. But Emma Briant, I wondered, you're closer to it, and geography matters. Do you have a sense that it's over? I know how much you've written about Bannon and how much you've written about the world around Trump, and so you know there's a danger that if it's over, it puts you out of business.
Well, for a start off, this isn't good for business.
My serious point is whether or not actually there is something fundamentally changed when a person who occupies the Oval Office leaves it.
Yes, of course. But in many senses, actually, Trump in opposition is almost a more formidable threat in some senses. What he can do now, if he leaves, obviously leaves politics and is actually part of that, far right media ecosphere that has been built up over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And by the way, this isn't a 4-year thing. This is something that has been building with Fox News's help, of course, over a long period of time. But which, he was obviously a figurehead for. And I don't think that's going anywhere. I think the Republican right is going to, have a solidified, mobilized, radical element that isn't going to be, ejected from the party. It's going to retain power. Tens of millions of Americans actually support the kinds of ideologies that are being espoused, and these conspiracy theories have actually been very powerful. One thing I would say is, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal first broke, I was one of the people involved in trying to raise awareness around this and reveal evidence. In 2018, a lot of people were, hanging on to this question of whether it won Donald Trump the election. And I've been trying for years now to try to say to people, actually, that's not the point. The point isn't whether this company and some algorithm made a difference in winning the election, or whether it was necessarily falsehoods that won it. Falsehoods have been around for a long time. The point is the infrastructure that has been created to advance these views, and the way that American media has enabled the rise of this has created something in American politics that is extremely dangerous. And I think
Emma, forgive me for interrupting. What I want to understand, though, is whether or not you think that was personal or structural. I'm going to ask Bryan Lanza in a moment about the sort of fight for the future of the Republican Party. Do you think that the nature of modern communication is such that it will automatically tend towards the most extreme and populist voice?
Yes, I do, very much so. I think this has been this is what makes the money, and unfortunately the entire political communication infrastructure has been oriented around something that enables especially right-wing populism, less so left-wing populism, but you still see left-wing conspiracy theories that are really damaging. But we've seen an uptick in hate crimes and so on as a result of this. It's very dangerous, and I don't think this is going anywhere. It may change in its form, but you've seen how different elements of this are important. It's social media, but everyone's focused very much on the social media organizations, and not thinking about this as a more structurally embedded phenomenon that is linked to the way that the political parties have evolved from, with the Republican Party through from the Tea Party movement through to today, with the building of the Breitbart nexus of media organizations. It's a far bigger infrastructure, and taking Trump out of the presidency does not change any of that. And I think even, removing 70,000 Twitter accounts that were pumping out QAnon, it dents it in the short term, but I don't think long term we're going to see any changes. And I think the way that these events are unfolding, there will be increasing attacks on mainstream media as a scapegoat for all of this, what's happening.
But Emma, what do you say to people who look at Joe Biden and say, if anything, a person who is extremely centrist above all things, and who overwhelmingly won, by every measure, and I don't just mean the presidency, but saw the Democrats, take the House, take the Senate. Surely there's a message here that the extreme wings of politics are not necessarily the paths to power.
Yes and no. The trouble is, what is power? I would say that the extreme right is still very, very powerful in America and in the world. And what we've seen is that it's not just about the presidency. It's also about trying to shape the infrastructure that's there and build an ability to advance economic power and things like this. You've seen as these pardons have unfolded. We've seen Steve Bannon, of course, being pardoned. Well, he was implicated in a case of fraud that is, was ongoing, and which a lot of this kind of these campaigns are all about trying to make money. And until we actually sort out the issues with corruption and with lobbying, Trump also, when he was outgoing, changed the lobbying laws and weakened them so that people from his administration can continue to lobby. And, I think these smaller things we don't quite grasp the power of how the political system can be, can be influenced. It's not just about having the presidency.
All right, Emma, thank you. I mean, I've sort of teed up Bryan Lanza. Bryan, thank you. I imagine you're going from studio to Zoom call to one thing or another. I don't know how it's going for you in the US, but at some point you're going to get a public service award in the UK for helping British people understand what's happening in Republican politics. But Bryan, what do you make of what Emma's saying, which is in the end that the sort of MAGA wing of the Republican Party will dominate even post-Trump? Do you think that's true?
I absolutely think it'll continue to grow. I mean, it'll always continue to grow as long as we have partisan news. The guest before, she didn't want to sort of put the label on it because I think she's protecting her left flank. But the partisan news is the cancer. It's the Foxes, it's the CNNs, it's the MSNBCs. It's how the coverage is being played out that creates these alternate universes for each side, so that they're shocked when they hear the truth. I suspect the guest before me spoke, she's highly informed on these things, but she probably gets her news from MSNBC and CNN. And the only reason I gather that is because she talked about Trump leaving at the end, changing these lobbying laws. Well, that didn't happen. Trump signed an executive order, which is not a lobbying law. It's a rule within the administration. And he rescinded it at the end. So if you're going to use the language, you've got to use the language accurately, because when you're inaccurate, you create these things. So now people are like, why did Trump change those laws? How dare he? Congress should be changing those laws. Listen, it was an EO that he wrote and he rescinded it. So these are the issues that create this sort of division, this alternate world where, we're never going to get out of this vortex until news starts covering news again.
So, Bryan, I'm going to come back to news in a second. I can see David Rhodes is scribbling some notes, and a fair few people too. But Bryan, let's just talk about the party and the Republican Party, because certainly if we'd been having this discussion the day after the insurrection on Capitol Hill, and we were here on January the 7th, the finger of blame would have been pointed not just at Trump, but, as you know, at those people in the Republican Party that had bolstered his claims about the election, and perhaps even more so those people within the party that had stood by for so long, right? And I wonder whether or not what you make of what happens now within the party if you take seriously his kind of closing popularity rating of 34%.
Listen, I think people are still in shock about what happened January 6th. They want the president held accountable within the Republican Party. I think you'll find some members who'll be able to exercise that right and do that with respect to impeachment. I think it's the right thing to do. I mean, he sent an angry mob to the Capitol to stop the certification of an American election. That to me is a red line. Some of the other things weren't red lines. You know, some of the policies in the administration we agreed, and so I don't necessarily characterize enabling him when you agree with those policies. I agree with the tax policies. I agree with the, some of the other policies. As for enabling him, I think a lot of people did after the election. I mean, we lost. I think, I was here saying, we lost. He's got some claims. They'll be litigated. They'll be done before the 14th of December. And for some reason, they just kept on pushing and pushing and pushing. And that reason goes back to what I said, is he had a safe base of partisan media that was going to continue to push that, whether it was Newsmax, whether it was OAN, or whether it was Fox. Like, that gives him the platform where nobody's pushing back on him saying, no, that's not accurate. He didn't go on the CNNs, he didn't go on the NBCs, he didn't go on broadcast. And so they can just live in their islands for a very long time. And that's a bad thing. But ultimately, that's the way we're structured now. And until truth matters, we're going to continue in this vortex. And truth matters on both sides. It just, nobody's listening to the truth right now.
And if you're Biden, you've made a promise. You've asked to be heard, but you've also made a promise to listen. And I wonder, Bryan, what you think at the end of the Trump presidency that Trump got right. We ran a piece of, actually, fun enough, in Tortoise today about what we think, what one person, Michael Brennan Doherty, thought Trump got right. I'm interested to know what you think the Republican Party will hold on to as the things that of this presidency that are true and are needed for America.
Yeah, listen, I'd say the economic policies. I think if you look at historically when Republican presidents run in the past, they've run on the Wall Street agenda. It was never the Main Street agenda. It was always Wall Street. Romney, McCain, Bush, those were their friends. Trump, when he tried to run, he got rejected by Wall Street at the end of the day. He was too bombastic. Wall Street, Hillary had sort of already ingrained herself and integrated herself in the culture of Wall Street, being a New York senator. So Trump didn't have that space. And so he created this new space for the Republican Party that was, anti-Wall Street and sort of anti-establishment, space that was more working class voters. And I think you've seen the shift in that. And I think if you look at those numbers overall, that continued growth is actually good for the Republican Party, because it's a number that's going to continue to grow at least for probably the next 30 years. And then you'll see a quick accelerated decrease after that. So, I mean, those economic policies are different than the traditional Republican. And I think that's why he appealed to those. I mean, he talked about those forgotten communities in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio that suffered because of NAFTA, because of Democrats and Republicans' policies. And they're all, the word back then was they're all on the side of Wall Street. And Trump came and found a base of the disaffected. And I think he brought awareness to that. And I think those disaffected tended to be Republican voters, non-college educated, lack of a better word, working class voters who are just, at the end of the day, that's 60% of the population still. And it's predominantly white. It's old. And that's why I say they have a short-term advantage. But I think, with Trump out of the way in the next election, hopefully, you won't have that same divisiveness. I think the best tool the Democratic Party ever had was Donald Trump, because he was the most unifying factor for all the factions in the Democratic Party. It usually takes months for all these people to get along. I mean, Trump did it overnight.
We'll see what happens then now that he's gone.
Yeah.
Bryan, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I'm going to ask my colleague Dave Taylor. We had an exchange about the shape of the Republican Party now, but before I go to Dave, I just want David Rhodes to respond to that point about news and the echo chamber of the American cable networks. Do you think that's right? Do you think it's causal?
Oh, I think it's not even just the cable networks. I mean, I think that one thing that really resonates that Bryan said is thinking about Trump. Look, all successful politics are sort of, I think, covering them, a mix of high and low. And the high and low of Trump the high was establishment Republicans, the business community, mission conservatives got what? 3 conservative Supreme Court justices, which will determine the Supreme Court for a generation. And early on, a really supply side oriented tax cut policy. But the low of it was so elemental to Trump's popular appeal was that he made trouble for the people that they didn't like. And there's actually been some good editorials about this, that it wasn't so much that, he personally just made difficulty for various constituencies that a really massive popular base of support just doesn't like. And the media is a big part of that. The language that we use to cover the news has gotten much more litigious. And so now reporting on American politics today is like reporting on Israel and the Palestinians 25 years ago in terms of how easy it is to step in it. And we've not gotten that right. There is a very good point being made there about who owns truth. And that's what many people are going to respond to negatively about Biden's address today, because the implication is that Democrats and their preferred media outlets are in charge of truth and everything else is just a bunch of lies. And it's not really that simple.
But David, if you go back to the words of the address, what he was talking about facts being manipulated and manufactured, right? And I get your point about manipulated, that's as old as time, right? There's a different thing, which is the kind of the mass production line, I suppose, speaks to Emma's point about the nature of our communications platforms, of manufactured facts, right? And there's surely a bipartisan argument to be had on that, isn't there?
There is. I guess the example I would give has to do with, what hasn't come up yet, which is the coronavirus. So yeah. It was an article of, so the sort of Democratic voters' view of the policy making around the coronavirus was that we need to follow the science, we need to listen to the scientists, that Anthony Fauci, our answer to, Chris Whitty was the ultimate authority on all things related to the virus, that we should be, members in good standing of the World Health Organization. And these were immutable facts, but actually none of those are facts. Most of those are opinions. And there is another legitimate view of just about every one of those points. So Anthony Fauci went on television last winter and told people not to wear masks or that they didn't need them. And then he later said, well, I said that for a strategic purpose because I was worried that public health officials or public health frontline workers wouldn't have the PPE that they needed. But now I'm telling you the truth and I'm telling you what you need to know. But he had sort of,
right.
He forfeited that. Also, let's follow the science. Well, a good scientist is like a good lawyer. They'll tell you, well, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that, and it's evolving in ways that, we're never quite sure what's the right way to go. So there isn't actually one way to follow the science, and so on. So I think that, look, facts can be in dispute, and that doesn't mean, that they aren't important. And we do need to get to a place where facts count or matter, or the truth matters. And the media culture is fairly toxic right now. But part of that is from people just not being honest with themselves about what's fact and what's actually open to interpretation and manipulation.
David, thank you. Bryan, before I come back to you, I wanted to ask Dave Taylor, my colleague, because we had an exchange this morning about the sort of factions that now exist within the Republican Party and how it organizes itself from here. And Dave, I just wanted to hear, Dave worked with me at the Times, then was at the Guardian, was in the States for the better part of a decade, and I sort of felt your wish, Dave, to be there physically. You were certainly there spiritually today. So what's your read on it?
Well, I think it's worth just returning to our question, isn't it? End of an era or start of the sequel, just to sort of keep our focus there. And I read something a couple of days ago that was trying to address the question of, how will Trump be remembered by history? And it was making the point that, most presidencies are boiled down to one or two factoids, really. It's 9/11 and Iraq, it's Vietnam and civil rights. And it was making a very good point, I think, that, for Trump, it's understandable that conservatives who've chosen to rather look the other way on his character flaws and have cleaved to tax cuts and conservative judges, the unfortunate truth for them is that he's going to be remembered in history for mishandling a pandemic that killed 400,000 people and inciting an insurrection. They're going to be his lions, unfortunately. And I think just that leads you to the question of, is he done? And it does certainly feel today, and let's face it, he's a great escapologist, so who knows? It feels today like he's done. It felt awful. I was struck by the fact that when Marine One landed at Andrews, he had the same theme music as Tony Soprano, which I don't know whether that was intentional, but it was rather magnificent. So it feels today like he's done, but it must be said that he's brought in a ton of money since November. People ask why he kept on keeping on with all of this stuff, and the answer is, he raised $200 million in the first month after the election by doing this whole Save America thing. And what people didn't really spot early on, when these mom and pop donations were coming in, was that 2/3 of it was going to a new Trump super PAC and 1/3 of it was going to the RNC. So what you do know is he's got a massive war chest, and so he's going to be hugely influential in the midterms. He'll be a kingmaker, and he's going to have a big role to play in 2024. And he's also still got a grip on the party machine. Tommy Hicks Jr., who's like an old henchman of Don Jr., is there at the top of the RNC. And so you sort of ask yourself the question, well, okay, he's going to be in there with a lot of money. Then you sort of think, well, who could run? And I think a clever way to look at it is to think about the lanes that people might be in. So there's obviously going to be the MAGA lane, there's going to be an establishment lane, and there might be a modernizers lane. And in the MAGA lane, you've got definitely Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, who are leading the way, saying anything shamelessly to try and inherit that MAGA voter base. Don Jr., who's like the lib-baiting camo action dude, thinks he should be the inheritor of all of that. And you look at the establishment. If you remember when Trump ran, everyone thought, oh well, it's going to be Jeb because the establishment. And this time around, you look and you think, well, who is there? There's Pence and there's Pompeo, but he truly has hollowed out that whole establishment party, which kind of leaves you with modernizers. Are some of the never Trumpers like Ben Sass gonna come to the fore? Probably not. But will someone who's got a message that the MAGA group can swallow and the sort of decent Republicans can go with, sail through the middle? And it left me thinking, well, okay, here's my tip. 2024, I think we're going to see an all-female race. I think we'll have Kamala Harris on one side, Nikki Haley on the other. She's played a blinder in, she was a Tea Party original in 2010. She got some sort of establishment props by going to the UN, didn't sort of cleave too closely to Trump to be tainted by him. And she's positioning in such a way that she can be a modernizer as well. I was looking at her bio from last year, and it was saying, I was always closer to his base than to him, and I always told him the truth when other people didn't want to. So there you go. So I think Kamala Harris versus Nikki Haley in 2024, but with a fuck ton of Donald Trump money in the background.
So well, I think you've done an amazing job there, Dave, not only in giving us a dissection of the Republican Party, but it's now nearly an hour and 40 minutes since the president was sworn in, and we've started the 2024
horse
race,
race.
and we've picked our front runners. So much for slow news. We seem to have got well ahead of ourselves there. But Bryan, but actually, you know, to Dave's point, when you look at it, that is a significant question, isn't it? Is who's going to carry the torch for the Republican Party? And I wonder whether you just give a sense of who you're going to watch in the next sort of 18 months, who you think will be really significant in shaping that Republican argument.
Yeah, listen, I think the midterms are going to matter. You're going to have Governor DeSantis out of Florida, who is the MAGA governor. You know, he's been very successful with COVID. Of all the big state governors, I think he's been one of the most successful with the response to COVID. You have, you know, and then you have the sort of long shot MAGA person, Governor Nomes in South Dakota. My good friend Corey Lewandowski's a client, I think. She's going to make a play for that. I think she's trying to hit that nerve. You also have some of the more establishment people, as you talk about, Governor Kim Reynolds in Iowa. You have Joni Ernst. I mean, I think you have probably the deepest bench that you've had in a very long time of candidates, you know, who are going to run for president, who have governor's experience and also have Senate experience. It's going to be quite a unique race, but I think the front runners that touch the MAGA nerve better than anybody is probably going to be Governor DeSantis out of Florida. He's got a re-election he's got to get through, and he has that case to make. But I think if he gets to re-election, he's pretty much in a strong position to be that MAGA lane for the Republicans.
And Bryan, just on COVID, many people thought that Governor DeSantis was essentially wiped out as a presidential candidate given Florida's handling of COVID. Implied in your tip towards him is that actually COVID is not going to make a big difference to the political careers of any leading Republicans.
No, I mean, listen, I think those people are, like I said, go to partisan news, and that sort of filters their reality. The reality is when you look at the numbers, you know, let's look at the infection rate in Florida compared to New Jersey, California, the big states. It's lower by 30 to 40%. You know, let's look at the death rate in Florida with respect to COVID. You know, it's lower by, you know, sometimes half. And so if you look at the real metrics as opposed to the partisan media and try to judge Governor DeSantis on the metrics of what is a successful COVID experience, his unemployment's not as low as these other states. So when you look at the metrics, I think Ron will be able to make a good case for himself. And that's the challenge we're going to have with the media going forward is you have the CNNs and the MSNBCs who just hate everything Republican. So they try to paint this picture of, you know, Ron did this horrible thing. When you just, all you have to do is just look at the death rate. It's lower by half, nearly half of what New York is. And then the media praised, you know, Governor Cuomo. So they create this alternate reality that's just at the end of the day, it's good for the partisans, but it's not good for the overall republic.
I want to just talk about some of the longer term effects of the Trump presidency and the world that Joe Biden inherits. I wanted to pick up a point that Rosie Willis made. I suppose you know, it was touched on. I think you touched on it, David, too, about the changes to the Supreme Court and whether or not, in some ways, the thing that we're underestimating is the extent to which the change or the solidification of the conservative majority on the Supreme Court will make a difference to the way in which politics is conducted. Rosie, you made that point in the chat, and I just wanted to understand what you meant by it.
So I guess I was just thinking in terms of Trump's legacy. Obviously, you have this world in which he's created a forum where politicians can behave in that way, and it becomes all about people and politics. But even looking at it,
Rosie, forgive me. Is it just me who's having trouble with the sound?
And you look at the fact
Rosie,
I think.
Rosie, apologies. I'm going to come back to you in a second. We just got a problem with the sound, so we couldn't hear you. So I'm going to come back to you in a moment. I'm going to go to Sam Houston. Firstly, in a conversation like this, you have to go to Sam Houston, although you'll find he's probably not yours, he's ours. Is Sam, you there?
Hey.
Hi. Hi there. Sam, it's only right and proper you should weigh in on this. You were talking about the Mike Pompeo tweets yesterday, and I just wanted to know what you read into them.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled on that yesterday. He kind of set out, a load of foreign policy stuff in a kind of way that I found a much more articulate exposition of their conservatism. It's not my politics, but at least I found it easy to follow in a way that Trump hasn't been for the last 4 years. It was things like alignment with Brazil and India, calling out the genocide in China, saying, quite starkly, China's not our friend, the CCP is not our friend, making multilateralism kind of justify itself. There's no point in just flying around the place to sit in rooms and chat if nothing is done. So that at least is a coherent kind of conservative set of kind of foreign policy aims. So I just wondered if anyone had a view on that. My hope is always that politics will return nearer to the centers that it has been over the last few years. I think that social media has driven a flight to the extremes and stretched the discourse. I've been thinking that for a long time. So I wondered if any of the panelists, or maybe perhaps Bryan, would see that as that sort of thing as being the future of the Republican Party for the next few years.
Bryan?
Yeah, listen, I think things return to normal for a while. I think you're going to see President Trump probably pop in from time to time and try to make news the way he does. But you're certainly going to see some of the older statesmen in the party, the Pompeos, the Pences, walk around and talk about who we are as conservatives, who the Republican Party is and going forward in the future. And that's a good thing. They're not going to be as exciting as they're not going to do it at these rallies for sure, but they're going to let their voices know because they're running for president, and they want to be able to demonstrate to the voters, at least the Republican voters who saw what happened on January 6th, that there can be stability again. I think none of us are proud of what happened on January 6th. And I think, they want to, change that image as fast as possible. So you're going to see them talking about, the multilateral, hopefully multilateralism a little bit more, rather than just be dismissive, but also engage in the necessary reforms that need to take place. Because, there's no point of having meetings just for meetings if nothing happens. I think Pompeo hit the main frustration of what conservatives feel, or what Trump people feel of globalism.
It was interesting. I mean, it was interesting, I have to say, just to kind of puncture some of the kind of sense of moment and history, Bryan. It was an interesting inaugural address in that, like a lot of inaugurals, it had a sort of philosophical thread to it. It didn't have much when it came to substance and policy. And I know that's not naturally the territory of inaugurals, but even as someone listening on the other side of the world, it was incredibly brief, the reference to America's place in the world. There was a passing discussion of rebuilding alliances. And I suppose one question that arose for me in that was, is America going to be so consumed by its own divisions and arguments that even if you have a Biden administration that is much more naturally given to that alliance building, the preoccupation of the president and his team is going to be that domestic argument?
Listen, I think the obsession of this American team is going to be COVID. I mean, that is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it's important that it's there. And I think at the end of the day, if they can do anything with our allies, is just show that they're going to be calm, even keel, nothing abrupt, nothing changes, boring again, and focus on the domestic policies of COVID 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that's a good thing. I mean, it's they feel they need to repair some things. I feel that probably some things need to be repaired as well. But COVID is why he's here. I mean, Biden didn't run a policy-driven campaign, so it's not going to be a policy-driven inauguration. He ran it, by saying, "I can bring stability, I can bring calmness. We're tired of this." I think he called him a clown at one of these debates. I mean, so he's lucky in that sense that he's not nailed down, because at the end of the day, his base is extreme left, and their policies are outside the mainstream of the U.S. And so that's what he's going to have to reconcile through Congress, and that's where his challenges lie.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Emma, I want to come back to you, and if I might, I'm going to try and see if I can bring in Una Farrell in a moment too. At the very beginning, we showed some slides about Republican support for what happened on Capitol Hill, but also the increased awareness of QAnon. And I don't know whether you saw, there was an interesting piece, I think it was the New Yorker actually, about the extent to which Democrats more than Republicans are aware of QAnon, i.e., there's an extent to which we not only demonize these problems, which might be quite demonic, frankly, but we exaggerate them. And I wondered whether or not you think that the arguments that are made around, as you put it, Russian trolling or QAnon conspiracy theories, that they're real problems, but they're not decisive ones in the conduct of politics.
Okay, I didn't say anything about Russian trolling.
No, sorry, not Russian trolling. You mentioned the Cambridge Analytica. Sorry, I jumbled my moments of political interference. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, because those are very different things.
Yes, they are now.
Analytica was a Trump campaign firm, and yeah. So bringing it back to QAnon, I don't think anybody's making the claim that the majority of the, of Republicans believe QAnon conspiracy theories. The point isn't that, these things are, so widespread across America that, it's now the new politics is QAnon. The issue is that even when like these conspiracy theories affect a small number of people, and by the way, it's a small but larger than it used to be subset of the American population that it has started to believe these kinds of conspiracy theories. So there, I have the figures right here. There's been. Sorry, I can't see the figures in front of me. Yeah, so okay, it's about half of Americans believe at least one disproven conspiracy theory. Now, these are sort of conspiracy theories come in all shapes and sizes, and these are things that a lot of Americans and people around the world can sometimes cling to for reasons of identity, power, all sorts of psychological needs to respond to a period of uncertainty in society that can result in bolstering these kinds of conspiracy theories. Even when they are a smaller subset of the population, that doesn't mean that they're not powerful and dangerous and carry risks with them. So, conspiracy theories have been linked to violence. They're linked to radicalization. And we've seen what results from these conspiracy theory influenced subsets of the population once they become part of a wider movement, which maybe, I'm not saying all Trump supporters in any way, shape or form believe in QAnon, but once these individual small subsets are part of a larger movement, these can have, an overall radicalizing effect. It can be reinforcing. If these false beliefs are not challenged, they can become very dangerous. And things which, are said subtly, perhaps in speeches by, President Trump, will be seen very differently by somebody who is a QAnon supporter than somebody who, isn't and is maybe a more mainstream Republican. But that doesn't mean that those words that are being, said aren't being said in a way that is very calculated and being said in a way that will have, create dog whistles for certain groups in that movement. And what I'm saying is it's very, very dangerous the way that these narratives have been utilized for political support and political purposes to build a movement.
I take that point, and I don't know whether it's Eli Cho or Ellie Cho was just pointed out that there was a Gab tweet today that says conspiracy theories are a great American pastime and absolutely protected by the First Amendment. So I suspect you're right. There's going to be more discussion in this regard. My colleague, fellow editor at Tortoise, Matt D'Ancona, wrote a book on post-truth. And so you probably spent more time in this world, Matt, than is healthy. I wonder what you think, whether or not you think, to answer the question we've set ourselves, it's the end or the start of the sequel.
Thanks, James. Well, I think to that point, I think there's a huge danger, which is, I suppose, emotionally natural today, that we all revert to pre-Trump thinking and pre-Trump comfort zones. And so we argue on the back of what was, I think, a very, good and powerful inauguration speech by Biden, that the pendulum has swung back to the center. An act of restoration and repair is already, well underway. We start talking about the personalities within the Republican Party for 2024. We start talking about party slates, Hawley versus Cruz versus Cotton versus, Haley. In much the same way as in 2014, 2015, we were talking about Jeb Bush, Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich. And along came Trump like a guided missile down the golden escalators and completely changed that. And I think that to your point about truth, I think that the problem with American politics now is that it's not polarized. It actually is two completely different parallel universes. And so you have the universe which is based in 1776, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, evidence, credentialism, experience, professional politics. And that universe feels understandably, revived and restored. But the new universe that came with Trump still exists. There are 75 million bad apples out there who voted for him. And I think his speech at Andrews Air Base, though it was on one level vulgar and ridiculous and maudlin and pathetic, was also terrifying and menacing, because it was fascinating that he didn't. The dog that didn't bark was he didn't get into the contesting of the election. That was the cliffhanger, was that, to be coming in the next episode. And, he's got the infrastructure. He's a network politician, not an institutional politician. The better question, I think, to ask is not who in the Republican Party might be the next Republican candidate, but who outside it might be the next Republican Party. Trump showed that you can become president without any experience, and indeed that you have an advantage as an insurgent. Watch the broadcasters who start to detach themselves from Fox. Watch the businessmen who start to militate against Biden as a kind of a mushy return to regulation and high taxes. They're the people to watch. And I think that whether or not he himself is going to be the leader or the prime figure in all of this is beside the point, because he was always and will continue to be as much a symptom as a cause, and he will be a dominant figure for a long time to come in that parallel universe. And I'm skeptical of the idea that parallel universe has suddenly disappeared simply because the other universe has managed to knock it sideways. It's still there. It still has a huge base, and there's a massive dialectical contest to come.
All right. Well, I'm going to wind this up by, first I'm going to wind this up by saying one thing that I really wanted to say at the beginning to everyone who was on, who may have just watched the speech or clips of it. If you get the chance, watch Amanda Gorman, because as a testament to the power of poetry and the poise of a 22-year-old, it's hard to beat. So if you're hosting an inauguration, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, book Amanda Gorman. She's unbelievable. And then my final question to the sort of three wise owls who come to this is a twofer. What my first question is it over, right? And I'd like a yes/no answer, by which I mean, have we seen the end of Donald Trump as an elected politician in America? And second, is it over in the sense that he will never have the influence over the Republican Party in the way that he has today again? So I'm going to start with Bryan, because this is frankly your specialist subject.
Yeah,
will he
listen,
ever hold office again? And will he ever hold as much sway over the Republican Party again?
I don't see how he holds office again. And I do think he's going to have a growing influence in the Republican Party for years to come, because there's just no countering voice to him.
Thank you, Bryan. Emma Briant?
I completely agree with that. Unfortunately, and I think, honestly, what really needs to happen is for America to drain the real swamp, because you know what? The elites in Washington are a problem. Unfortunately, he was too in deep up to his eyeballs with the elites, and there was nothing that he was going to do to stop that. So what we really need from Biden is actually to help clean up the real swamp in Washington. And unfortunately, I think that remains to be seen whether Biden is serious about doing so.
Emma, thank you. David?
There was a whole echo of the financial crisis in the support for Trump. People that just felt like they got left behind. You know, Wall Street was bailed out. Everybody went and bought bigger houses in the Hamptons, and they got nothing. And that changed the Republican Party in ways that post-Trump, the Republican Party is really struggling with today, because it was a fractious coalition. Bryan makes a great point that Democrats, who are ordinarily extremely difficult to unify, unified for this purpose, only this purpose, and that was getting rid of Trump. But having done that, the unresolved arguments there, that's the story we haven't talked about today. Before I moved here, February last year, I was working for the LA Times, and we thought Super Tuesday was going to be the biggest story of 2020. And, people forget Bernie Sanders won the California Democratic primary. He was the most popular figure in the party in its most important state. So there's plenty of unresolved conflict to go around, and not just whether Trump can sustain any of the enthusiasm that he gained.
Interesting. All right. Well, listen, I want to say thank you. Thank you for gathering your thoughts quite so quickly, David, Emma, and Bryan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. For what it's worth, I'll give you my view, is that we're always surprised how quickly power fades. And my suspicion is that he won't dominate our thinking in the way in which he has in the last 4 years, in any way, in anything like the way that way again. But we'll see. For what it's worth, on a historic and fascinating day, it's been brilliant to actually share it and think out loud about what it all means. A big thank you to Bryan Lanza, to Emma Briant, to David Rhodes, but as ever to all of you. We will see you for a next series of thinkings. In fact, tomorrow we are deep in the subject of COVID, a global health summit. It starts at 9 o'clock. And if you want to understand not just COVID, but what COVID's impact is going to be on the nature of our healthcare systems, join us then. For now, good night. Thanks for joining us.